In an age of rapid and evolving communications, everyone's deepest desire is to be heard. We're social beings, born to connect, sharing a common humanity. We need each other. We long to be listened to have a sense of belonging and to be accepted. What do we fear the most? Loneliness? Being forgotten? Lack of love for who you are? What does this say about the deepest desire of the human heart? Every human being, no matter who they are or where they come from, possesses dignity because they are created in the image of God. Human dignity is the heartbeat of the gospel. Each one of us created as God's work of art. What does this ask of us? The pandemic has given us a moment to pause and to breathe. Now it feels like it is a time to act. It's a call to roll up our sleeves and to live our spirituality on the streets. In this year of our sesquicentenary, it's a time for celebrating our Marist mission of making Jesus Christ known and loved among the young, especially the most neglected. Let our prayer be that everyone, especially the least, the lost and the invisible, are known and loved as we strive to uphold, restore and defend the dignity of all.
Good evening. Warami Walamabami. In Darug language, hello to you wherever you have come from. Welcome to the 2022 Marian Lecture. My name is Maddie Ford and I am currently a guest upon Darug country. I invite you to acknowledge the country you're a guest upon by typing the name into the chat. Let us take a moment to acknowledge the first peoples of the nations of this land who have dwelt in this country for many thousands of years. They are the traditional custodians of the land upon which we gather today. We pay our respects to their elders past, present, and future. We take a moment of stillness now to pause and pray for our world. And we begin in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Gracious and compassionate God, you hear the cries of all who are in trouble or distress. May I stand in solidarity with the struggle of those whose lives are affected by a loss of dignity. Grant us courage to face what the future holds, so that your light may show us the way to joy and profound peace. Enable us, merciful God, to be loved today and always. We ask through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. I would like to introduce Brother Peter Carroll, leader of the Marist Association of St. Marcelin Champagne and the Provincial of the Marist Brothers, to introduce Father Frank Brennan and lead the facilitation of our lecture this evening. Thank you, Brother Peter.
Thank you very much, Maddie. Good evening. Wherever you are in Australia or possibly overseas, whatever country you're on tonight, welcome. Welcome to the 5th Marian Lecture, an annual lecture conducted by the Marist Association of St. Marcelin Champagne. The purpose of the Marian Lecture is to inform, inspire, and challenge us as people of faith, followers of Jesus Christ, and Marists. I'm confident that our presenter this evening will do just that. Father Frank Brennan's is one of the most respected public voices in Australia, particularly on ethical and social issues. He is a Jesuit priest who is currently the rector of Newman College within the University of Melbourne. He has held other positions within the Society of Jesus and was the CEO of Australian Catholic Social Services immediately prior to taking up his current position. He is a lawyer and academic, a distinguished fellow of the PM Glynn Institute at Australian Catholic University, an adjunct professor at the Thomas More Law School at ACU, and research professor at the Australian Centre for Christianity and Culture. He is a prolific writer, seemingly contributing weekly to journals and publications, and is the author of at least 6 books, ranging from Acting on Conscience to the more recent Observations on the Pell Proceedings. However, he is best known as a public advocate for justice, humanity, and dignity. He has commented on such diverse issues as Aboriginal and reconciliation, religious freedom, refugees and asylum seekers, abortion, medically assisted suicide. Through his writing and advocacy, he has contributed significantly to the development of public policy within Australia and has been a member of Commonwealth Government panels and commissions. His consistent, passionate support for justice and human rights has been recognised publicly. He received the Migration Institute of Australia's 2013 Distinguished Service to Immigration Award, the 2015 Eureka Democracy Award. He is a recipient of the Humanitarian Overseas Service Medal for his work in Timor-Leste when director of the local Jesuit Refugee Service, and a recipient of the Australian Centenary Medal for service with refugees and human rights work in the Asia-Pacific region. He has been awarded honorary doctorates by the University of New South Wales and the Queensland University of Technology. I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Father Frank Brennan SJ to deliver the 2022 Marian Lecture.
Thank you very much, Brother Peter, and greetings to you all from Camaragal country. And I must say I'm delighted to be with the Marian family this evening to reflect on the question, human dignity and Aussie value, ? And I dare say when I was Maddie's age, we usedn't put a question mark there. We just thought that, of course, human dignity was an Aussie value. But I think sadly, as the young people in the audience tonight would appreciate, there is now a question mark. So what are we to make of this question about human dignity and Aussie value? As Brother Peter said, I'm now the rector of Newman College, a university college in Melbourne, and there are 300 young people there. I haven't been used to living with a lot of young people for some time, so it's something of a new experience. And in the wake of what we've all come through, I think as we speak about human dignity, we've got to first of all be apprised of our reality, particularly the reality of young people. It seems to me in Australia today, the present generation of young people are the first generation, probably since the Second World War, which was a very long time ago, even before I was born, first generation since the Second World War who don't have the promise that life will be materially better for them than it was for their parents and their grandparents. And that job security is not necessarily what it once used to be. But I think also there are many existential questions which are confronting young people which didn't have to confront me as I was commencing my university studies. Think, for example, just of the challenge of climate change and what will become of our planet. Think also of the pandemic through which we've now come and are still emerging. Something like that was completely unimaginable when I was carefree at university. And think now of the situation in the Ukraine, with the aggression being displayed by Russia. We know that, of course, there have been serious mistakes made by other superpowers, including the United States in the past. But we live under a world order which until now has basically sustained our peace and security. And it was posited on the idea that there was a Security Council with the Permanent Five who had a veto and also possessed nuclear weapons. It was thought impossible that one of those superpowers would exercise wanton aggression in the country next door simply to acquire further territory. So these are some of the big questions which confront us as we come to this issue of human dignity, asking how it might be an Aussie value in our present context. I have to say, Brother Peter, I thought it was a bit cruel of the Marist to ask me, a Jesuit, to reflect on this question during a federal election campaign. Because let's face it, and we've only got a couple of weeks to run on it, the advertisements we're seeing, they don't do much to evoke a sense of Aussie values, do they? And they definitely don't do much to evoke a sense of human dignity, at least not in one's political opponents. So we're engaged in a situation at the moment where we have to make a fresh claim on human dignity as an Aussie value. For us, coming from the Catholic tradition, I think it's always useful to look at the teachings of our popes, particularly the present Pope, Pope Francis. And I say that not just because he too is a Jesuit, but I think that helps. Think, for example, of his great encyclical Laudato Si. Why is that such a great encyclical? Because it offers us the insight on tonight's topic of human dignity, that each of us cannot maintain our own human dignity, let alone accord human dignity to others, unless we hold front and centre four things. First, each of us must accept a personal responsibility for the state of the planet, for the sake of future generations. Secondly, each and every one of us should have an eye for those who are on the margins, for those who are missing out. And no matter where we might live, no matter how comfortable our circumstances, no matter what the situation in our school or our classroom, there'll always be someone there on the margins, someone who's missing out. And thirdly, we must always have a consideration for the common good, the public interest, not just our own self-interest, not just the interest of our own church, not just the interest of our own family group, not just the interest of our own social circle, but for the good of the whole of the community. And finally, and most importantly, that we should pay attention to our own sense of interior well-being, our own sense of interior peace. I know that for a lot of you who are young people, you don't find the same appeal that I and people older than me in the Catholic Church have found in what we might call the sacramental economy. That is, the life of the sacraments, the life of the Eucharist, where we can find sustenance and community. Where you don't find it there, you have to find it elsewhere. And you've got to find ways of celebrating and maintaining that deep interior life, that spirit of prayer, or if you don't want to call it prayer, make sure you're doing your yoga or whatever those exercises might be. Let me come to just a couple of challenging paragraphs in Laudato Si on the topic of human dignity. In paragraph 65, and you might note it down for later, Pope Francis says this: those who are committed to defending human dignity can find in the Christian faith the deepest reasons for this commitment. How wonderful is the certainty that each human life is not adrift in the midst of hopeless chaos, in a world ruled by pure chance or endlessly recurring cycles. The Creator can say to each one of us, before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. We were conceived in the heart of God, and for this reason, each of us is the result of a thought of God. Each of us is willed, each of us is loved, each of us is necessary. I'd like to come to the first major challenge tonight, that is the issue of refugees. And Brother Peter, if I could have the slide there on the screen of the statement that was recently issued by religious leaders, including yourself. Before we get to the text, a little background, and let me tell a slightly Marist story. Here we are in 2022. I think back to the election of 2013. You might remember at that time, the Prime Minister of Australia was not Scott Morrison. The Prime Minister was one Kevin Rudd. He went to a Marist school, to Marist Ashgrove. I had been in the country of Myanmar during the week. I'd arrived back on a Friday evening, and Kevin Rudd, a good friend of mine, had made an announcement about refugees and asylum seekers, people coming by boat. He said that thereafter, anyone who came by boat would be taken to either Papua New Guinea or Nauru, and they would never be allowed to settle in Australia, and they would be held in detention. For his part, his opponent, Tony Abbott, and I have to admit that he went to a Jesuit school, St. Ignatius College, Riverview, he joined in what some thought a race to the bottom in saying that we would stop boats as a government by stopping boats, by turning them back towards Indonesia. When these announcements were made, I sat down, having returned from Myanmar. I was in the Qantas Lounge in Sydney, and I wrote my assessment, and I got it published immediately on our Eureka Street website. I then flew to Brisbane, and I walked into the home of Kevin Rudd and Therese Rain for Therese's 50th birthday. I was ushered into the prime ministerial study. I said, Kevin, before you say anything, I should tell you, I've already published my assessment of what you've done. We then had a 1-hour conversation, which I'll never reveal. But at the end of it, I said to him, you have to do what you have to do. I have to do what I have to do. There are very complex issues in our world. It's very easy to talk simplistically about human dignity, but we live in a very wealthy, pluralistic, democratic society, which is an island nation continent. As Paul Keating once famously remarked, when they were giving out continents, there weren't too many, but we Australians were very blessed. If we're honest with ourselves, we all know that most of us won't vote for a party unless they assure us of the security of our borders. Most of our fellow Australians won't vote for a party unless they have an orderly migration program. How do we hold together the need for secure borders and an ordered migration program, while at the same time extending the welcome to those who are fleeing asylum? These are very difficult questions. But if we are committed to human dignity as an Aussie value, we've got to be prepared to have the difficult discussions, and we've got to be able to see things through the eyes of those who are most on the margins. And so, with this election coming forward, we know, we've heard Mr. Albanese, he even stumbled a few times, didn't he? Saying, oh yes, we want to stop the boats as much as the other mob and all that sort of thing. But there is a material difference between the major parties, and that is on what are called temporary protection visas. I dare say many of you already know people living in our community on a temporary protection visa. It means that even though they are now proven refugees, because of the manner in which they travel to Australia, they're never to be given a permanent visa. They're never to have a right of family reunion. Every 3 or 5 years, their life is on hold as they have to renew that visa. This affects over 20,000 people now living in our community. In the college where I am, we have a wonderful Hazara from Afghanistan in this situation, and he's a final year medical student, making a wonderful contribution to our society. So if we're serious about human dignity, our religious leaders have said, and you'll see the words there in bold print, we urge our political leaders to reconsider the needs and futures of people who are still on temporary protection visas. It's time to offer these people permanent protection. We raise this matter cautiously, mindful of how fraught discussion of such matters has been in the previous federal elections. And so there, at the bottom of the screen, we speak now relatedly out of deep concern about the current division between the two major parties on the issue of temporary protection visas. These visas serve no public policy purpose and have lost community support since introduction 2 decades ago. The tone of the statement is respectful to our political leaders. Religious leaders don't have to seek election. We know that those seeking election have to be responsible in terms of secure borders, in terms of an orderly migration program, but they also have to have a humanitarian heart when it comes to those who now live permanently in our midst, even though they're only given temporary status. If human dignity is an Aussie value, would we not say to ourselves that those who are proven refugees who live among us, who contribute to our society, they deserve to be allowed to reside here permanently, and they deserve to be able to be reunited with their families? Isn't that the appropriate balance in terms of human dignity as an Australian value? Whenever we consider questions of this sort, we must also, as Australians, of course, consider the situation of our First Nations people. So we could have the next slide, the Uluru Statement from the Heart. This evening, I've decided to just take a couple of quotes from that Uluru Statement and to draw your attention to it, because I dare say most of you are like a lot of decent Australians who say, yes, we fully support the Uluru Statement from the Heart. But I have to ask, as I've asked a number of audiences of late, do you actually know what's in it? And do you actually know where those words come from? In the Uluru Statement, issued 5 years ago by key Aboriginal leaders and groups gathered at Uluru, they spoke of their sovereignty. And they stated what's there in the bottom paragraph. This sovereignty is a spiritual notion the ancestral tie between the land or Mother Nature and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who were born therefrom, remain attached thereto, and must one day return thither to be united with our ancestors. This link is the basis of the ownership of the soil, or better, of sovereignty. Now, I don't know about you, but I've never met an Aboriginal person who uses that sort of language, being born therefrom, remaining attached thereto, and one day returning thither. So what's going on here? Where does this quotation come from? The Aboriginal leaders who gathered at Uluru knew that these words appeared in two of the key judgments of the High Court of Australia in the epic decision on native title, namely the Mabo decision in 1992. But our two Australian High Court judges, they didn't invent the words. They in turn were quoting a Lebanese judge, Judge Amoun, on the International Court of Justice in 1975 in what was called the West Sahara case. But it goes even further. Judge Amoun was not creating these words himself. They were a direct quote from a Congolese lawyer by the name of Mr. Bayona Barmea, who appeared before the International Court of Justice in order to convince the Europeans on the court that the people of Africa were not primitives, that the notion of terra nullius was inhumane, that the notion of terra nullius denied the dignity of the people who were the traditional owners of the land. Mr. Bayona Barmea, who came from the Congo and was there appearing before the International Court of Justice, appearing for the country Zaire, he made this observation to the judges there at The Hague. He said, "The peasant African does not have running water in his hut or thatched cottage. He has neither electricity nor telephone. Perhaps he can neither read nor write. But on the other hand, he hardly suffers from hypertension nor chronic insomnia. He does not suffer heart attack nor liver failure. He has no problems with pollution of all kinds. When he feels a little uneasy, he goes into the forest nearby picking the right plant, which nature has endowed with powers that reveal themselves only to the man living in conscious contact with it." Can't you imagine? There would have been some sitting in this courtroom who thought that this Congolese lawyer appearing for Zaire had lost the plot. They'd have thought this poetry has no place in a court of justice. How wrong they were. It was his advocacy which laid bare that indeed, if you want to be serious about human dignity for all, you have to respect the rights, the aspirations, and the perspectives of your First Peoples. So, having set that as the context, our Aboriginal people have put before us a challenge. And if I could have the next part of the slide. They've said, we call for the establishment of a First Nations voice enshrined in the Constitution. A lot of talk going on about this at the moment, isn't there? Mr. Morrison's made clear he's not for having any referendum. Mr. Albanese, on the other hand, has said, well, in his first term as Prime Minister, he'd do something, but let's wait for the catch. Here we are, all anxious to enhance the human dignity of all Australians, especially those who are now known as First Nations peoples. What then is the way forward? We have to remember that for a referendum to be passed under the Australian Constitution, it requires a majority of the voters in a majority of the states. That is, you need 50 plus 1% of Australians generally, and then you need majorities in 4 out of the 6 states. Very difficult to do. Now, there have been 44 attempts at that since Federation. Only 8 have succeeded. In the interests of human dignity, in the interests of ensuring that this doesn't go off the rails, let me sound a very stern warning note should the Labor Party be elected to government. The Labor Party, for its part, has sponsored 25 referenda proposals. 24 of those have failed. The Labor Party has succeeded only once. And those Australians who voted in that referendum are now over 97 years of age. It was a referendum about child endowment and maternity allowances, something which was a self-evident proposition which would win support. If we are to do anything to enhance the dignity of Australia's First Peoples with recognition in the Constitution, we all need to do much more to convince our fellow Australians, and particularly to convince the Liberal Party and the National Party to come on board. Or perhaps to put it another way, we all need to work harder to ensure that the philosophical concerns of those in the Liberal and National parties are met as we try and seek a way forward in seeking this First Nations voice. So the challenge is great. Some would say they don't support anything special being put in the Constitution for Aborigines and Torres Strait Islanders. But let's remember this. The Commonwealth Parliament presently has power to make laws with respect to the people of any race for whom it's deemed necessary to make special laws. That's a very 19th century provision. If we're going to make special laws for Aborigines, shouldn't we at least consult them? Isn't that the basis of human dignity? Isn't that the core of our Australian values? That if the Commonwealth Parliament is to make laws with respect to Aborigines and Torres Strait Islanders, for whom it's deemed necessary to make special laws, that those special laws be made only after consultation with them. And if there is to be consultation, don't you need some body, some entity which can be there to represent Aborigines and Torres Strait Islanders as those consultations occur? So they're just a couple of the issues that I would raise in terms of wondering about Australian values of human dignity. Another issue, which is on the burner at the moment, isn't it, for those of you involved in Catholic education, is the whole question about the recognition of religious freedom and ensuring that we do not discriminate against our students on the basis of their gender or sexual orientation. Once again, these are matters which are complex in terms of the law, but I think the principles are simple, and we must always act in a dignified manner towards each other in the processes that we follow and in the outcomes that we seek. Of course, we as Catholics, you as the Marian family, want to be able to maintain the right to be able to teach in your school your doctrine and to teach according to the ethos of your institution as the Marian family. But might I dare to speak for the Marian family and say, the Marian family, of course, would not want to discriminate against a student on the basis of their sexual orientation or gender. And the Marian family would not want to be discriminatory against a teacher on those criteria, provided, of course, the teacher, whether homosexual or heterosexual, for example, was on board with what was the agenda and the ethos of the school. That's what is the challenge for us in ensuring that human dignity is maintained. Let me, in conclusion, put what I think, at least for me, is the greatest challenge as an Australian in confronting this question about human dignity in a globalised world, in asking whether it is an Aussie value. Particularly during times of a federal election, I think we've got to admit that our politicians know the way to appeal to us is to appeal to our primitive self-interest. If it not be our individual self-interest, then to our primitive national self-interest. Here is the real challenge of human dignity. Here is the real challenge of the Catholic tradition. For any church family that is privileged to reside in a first world country, particularly with secure borders. In paragraph 193 of Laudato Si, Pope Francis says this: if in some cases sustainable development were to involve new forms of growth, in other cases, given the insatiable and irresponsible growth produced over many decades, we need also to think of containing growth by setting some reasonable limits and even retracing our steps before it is too late. We know how unsustainable is the behaviour of those who constantly consume and destroy, while others are not yet able to live in a way worthy of their human dignity. Pope Francis says this, and it's very directed at us as Australians, as to Americans, as to the English, etc. That is why the time has come to accept decreased growth in some parts of the world in order to provide resources for other places to experience healthy growth. You think that could ever be seen as an Australian value? Because it is essential in a globalised world for the human dignity of all. Pope Francis reminds us that his predecessor, Benedict XVI, had said, technologically advanced societies must be prepared to encourage more sober lifestyles while reducing their energy consumption and improving its efficiency. Well, I think it'll be well after my lifetime that I see a group of independents standing in contested seats saying what we're standing for is less economic growth in Australia so that we might do more for the poorest nations on earth. But I want to suggest to you that's ultimately what's required for universal human dignity. But not even I, as a Jesuit, am going to be so bold as to pretend that that is presently an Australian value or has ever been an Australian value. But it is a challenge I want to put to you as the up and coming generation in the Marian family. So, as we gather this evening under this rubric, during an election, post-pandemic, with the Ukraine war, and with issues of climate change, let's take heart together that we can be connected as we are around Australia, and that we can affirm the dignity of each other in our processes and affirm the dignity of each other in what we seek for the planet, what we seek for those on the margins, what we seek for the common good, and what we seek for our own interior well-being. Thank you very much for the opportunity. Great to be with you, and I'll be very happy to take any questions or observations. And don't be afraid to disagree with me, because the pollsters would say most Australians disagree with me most of the time, just they don't often tell them. Thank you.
Frank, thank you very much for your insightful, intelligent, and really challenging words tonight. We are going to just invite everyone to pause for 2 minutes and to just ponder what Frank has said, to let some thoughts, some responses emerge. You might like to note something down. I'd encourage you to put it into the form of a question and then put it into the chat so I can put some of those to Frank. But I think first of all, just some silence, and in the silence, let's just bring our heart and mind to what we have heard from Frank. So you're invited to put your questions into the chat now, and then we will relay them to Frank. But Frank, to start with, maybe a personal question.
Sure.
What most influenced you to take up a very public ministry of advocacy and defence of human dignity?
I think for me, Peter, it was that I was brought up in Queensland and I went to a large Catholic country boarding school run by a missionary of the Sacred Heart in Toowoomba. And it was a very laid-back sort of situation to be educated, I have to say. I've sometimes joked that when I then moved to Sydney and Melbourne and the Jesuits, where everyone wanted to know what school you went to, it was a complete irrelevance where I was from in Queensland. And I always felt slightly second class that my father didn't drive a tractor. But from there, I started university in what turned out to be quite an epochal year, 1971, which I know seems like absolute ancient history to Maddie and the other listeners of that generation. But in 1971, and you might find this impossible, you young people, to even imagine, but in 1971, there was a rugby tour to Australia by the Springboks from South Africa. And it was an all-white rugby tour. And in Queensland, we had a colourful premier by the name of Joe Bjelke-Petersen, who was a no-nonsense sort of person. And he declared a state of emergency so that the Springboks could play their rugby game. And I was a first-year law student and a first-year politics student, and I thought what was happening was wrong, was very wrong. And at the same time, we had a vice-chancellor of the university who happened to be Zelman Cowen, who later went on to become Governor-General. And I actually had conversations as a first-year student with Sir Zelman Cowen about the rightness or the wrongness of what was occurring. And at the same time, there were young Aboriginal people who, for the first time, I think, were becoming eloquent on the Queensland University campus. People like Cheryl Buchanan and Dennis Walker and Sam Watson. And I was very challenged, particularly by the anger with which they spoke. And I thought, surely our society is better than that. And so gradually I started to familiarise myself with the social and political and legal situation of first Australians in that part of the world. And I think that gradually fired my enthusiasm for what I would call the relationship between faith and justice. And as it was, I then joined the Jesuit order in 1975. And at that time, we'd had a Jesuit congregation in Rome, which strictly emphasized the relationship between faith and justice. Basically saying, how can you really say you believe in Jesus as the Son of God and as the brother of us all, unless you have a commitment to justice, particularly to justice for those who are the poorest, the most marginalized. And I think that has animated my life ever since. And it's been a great privilege.
Thank you very much, Frank. Ray Ackhurst asks, do you see a way to rephrase the issue of prosperity to one of the quality of life?
Well, I think that's a very good way of putting it. My fear is that all of us know we live in a very materialistic, secularistic environment. And so trying to translate the language, it may work for some people, but I think for many, there would still be a clinging to that material wealth and prosperity and power. But I think, and this is one of the things I admire greatly, I must say, about the younger generation coming through, where there can be almost a lack of interest in things to do with wealth and power, but a real affirmation of the necessity of quality of life. And For those of us of a religious disposition, of course, Jesus came that we might have life and have life to the full. That is a quality of life, a great quality of life. And if only that could be shared with others. Think, for example, and I think, so often we lose sight of the common good or the public interest, how that can assist us with our own quality of life. Early in the stage with the development of the COVID vaccinations. I mean, if only we'd done more to bring the vaccinations to less prosperous countries, guess what? It would have probably meant that the new strains would not have emerged, at least in the numbers or the rapidity with which they did, if only we had that generosity of spirit. So I think it's got to be quality of life, not only for us as individuals, not only as society, but for the planet, for humanity generally.
Thank you, Frank. There have been a couple of questions there about hope. And how do we bring hope to our young people in such an environment? I mean, you quoted before the situation we're in with global warming and the Ukraine war and the divisions and fractures in various aspects of our world. So what is going to instill a sense of hope in young people?
The great lesson for me in hope came in 1987 when I was working for a few months in a large refugee camp on the Thai-Cambodian border. There were 100,000 people in the camp, and they were Khmers, Cambodians. And I was there as an idealistic young Australian. I'd only recently been ordained as a priest, and I went over there as I thought, Peter, I will go and bring these people some hope. That's what they most want and what they most need. So there was I, the very good young Australian priest, getting off the plane and going to the refugee camp to bring them hope. And I remember after lunch one day, I walked into the camp, the bamboo huts and all the dust around and the excessive heat. And I greeted a young Cambodian man. I said to him with a smile on my face, and how are you today? It's a beautiful sunny day. And he looked at me, his English was quite good. He looked at me and he said, it's all very well for you, but I am a Khmer. And it summed it up. I was there as a volunteer. I was there to do good. I was there feeling good about myself. And I could leave whenever I wanted to and go back to my life of freedom. He was a Khmer. He was locked in there. He had no resources and seemed to have little potential for the future. I went home that night and thought, well, what's the point of my being here? I can't bring that man hope as if I was bringing a bundle of flowers or a present or something like that. But the insight I came to was this. I thought, no, it's necessary that people like myself, outsiders, that we're here, because there may come a time where that man or his colleagues will want to express hope, and they need someone to whom to express it. And hope which is unexpressed is hope which dies. So I think the challenge, I'd say, particularly for the Marian family in your educational context with young people, is creating that atmosphere, that environment, which is supportive and which is enhancing of the dignity, particularly of those students doing it tough, so that when they find hope, they can have the confidence to express it because the relationship is there. Unless the relationship is there, then the hope will not be expressed. And as I say, hope unexpressed is hope which dies.
Thank you. Igor wrote in the chat, today I was interviewing a same-sex couple with an intention to enrol their son. I got the sense that they felt on the outer. It was heart-wrenching for me personally. How do we continue to develop dignity in families and schools?
I think, Igor, obviously you conducted the process very well. You're not going to overcome that sense of alienation in one meeting. But the fact that the couple have sought the enrolment, the fact that you have treated them with dignity and with respect, and the fact that they've gone away knowing that their child will be assessed in exactly the same way as any other child would be for entry to that school, that's as good a beginning of relationship as you could hope for. So I'd simply say, keep it up.
Alan LeBrock from Marian College, Griffith, asks, does the Australian media dictate an agenda that lacks the courage to challenge the social justices that you raise?
It does, but I mean, the mainstream media, it's a marketing operation. They give us what they think we want. And I'd have been more concerned about this probably 10 years ago. My concern now is not so much the mainstream media. As I say, I mean, living as I do now in a university college with 300 students, I don't think any of them read newspapers. I don't think any of them access the mainstream media of any sort in order to get their news. They live in bubbles, social media bubbles, where I think part the problem is, and we're all guilty of it, we receive the information, the opinions, and the value-added utterances that we want to hear. And we shop for them, and that's where we get it all. And so we increasingly live in an atomized society where there is less and less prospect of that truly dignified cross-fertilization of ideas and engagement across difference. And I think that's rather the problem now.
So it's been said that we get the governments we deserve. Do we get the media we deserve as well?
Well, in part we do, but I think another part of it has to be that, at least with the web and all of that, we are all given the opportunity now to create media of our own. I mean, just think, for example, of this Zoom session that we're having tonight. 10 years ago, it was unimaginable. Now, I think it is one of the positive developments of COVID. And I think we ought to cherish these sorts of opportunities more, rather than sitting around and whinging about what the Australian or the Age or the Sydney Morning Herald or the Sun Herald has said today or whatever. It's that we now have it within our grasp in order to create a media of our own. And I think we need to do more of that.
Frank, there's a group gathered at Newman College in Perth, that is, high school. And their question is, will the Russian invasion of the Ukraine change the government's approach or response to refugees? Is our response conditional on where refugees come from?
Well, I think there's a lot in those couple of questions. I think posited in the question is a presumption that are we as Australians more likely to be sympathetic if those refugees are European rather than not European, and if they're Christian rather than any other religion? Now, I would hope that we now live in a society where our refugee policy is truly non-discriminatory, particularly on the basis of race. What's essential to ensure is that when you have a refugee policy, with the Ukrainians, I think what is more likely is, because it is not very likely that they will get themselves to Indonesia and try and seek access by boat, that there is a greater chance that we will take more of them with our offshore processing arrangements, particularly in other countries in Europe. And I would hope that that would be a good thing. The other thing to say is that I think that no matter who is in government, getting them to increase the humanitarian quota each year depends very much on community sympathy. So given that there is a strong community sympathy at the moment for the plight of Ukraine, then I would expect that no matter who is in government, if there be an ongoing flow of refugees out of Ukraine, that there would be an increasing acceptance by the Australian government of the day that we should take more rather than take less.
Emma Timms wants to know what we can do more tangibly to teach our young people to have a humanitarian heart. How do we move them from action, not simply an awareness?
Well, it can only be done through relationships. And I know in the Marian family, you're very good at this in arranging experiences for your students so that they can encounter those not just part of their social group. I often go back to, the great teaching of Pope John Paul II, of the two key notions that he had about interdependence and solidarity. Interdependence is about knowing and understanding the relationship of my social situation to the social situation of somebody else. But then once I've made that cognitive assessment, I've then got to move from the head to the heart to take a stand in solidarity. If I could give an example, many years ago, after the Indonesian invasion of East Timor, Bishop Bello invited me to go to East Timor. It was 1 year after the Santa Cruz massacre. It was a very poignant experience for me because I was meeting young Timorese who were basically in a situation that I knew that the reason that the Indonesians had been given the all clear to take over East Timor was that it was the end of the Vietnam War. There was fear by the United States and by Australia that the unstable East Timor could become the Cuba of our region. And therefore approval was given for the Indonesians to come in and take it over. And so the very situation which guaranteed my peace and security as an Australian was the same situation which created the lack of peace and security for those young Timorese. And therefore, noting that situation of interdependence, I felt driven to take a stand in solidarity with the Timorese. And so I think it only comes out of the experience of the relationships, and therefore I would always espouse within the Marian family your openness to those social situations where you then have the capacity back in the classroom to reflect upon them, moving from interdependence to solidarity.
Thank you very much, Frank. We have a question here from Wayne Marshall at John Terry College in the Macarthur. He says the political party machines have led to the growth of professional politicians like never before. Fractional, religious, cultural groups abound. Will our system ever change and be able to put heart back into politicians' work and priorities?
Well, that's going to depend on part, isn't it, on the graduates out of the Marian family of the next generation. And if they're not going to come out of the Marian family, where are they going to come from? I could tell a story slightly against the Jesuits. I remember many years ago when John Howard was early in his time as Prime Minister, and I think there were 7 or 8 Jesuit alumni on his front bench. And I was at a meeting of the Jesuits of Australia, and there was some pride, I'd have to say, that, well, we had 7 or 8 of our alumni who were there on the government's front bench. And I got up and I said that I worked mainly with Aborigines and refugees, and they told me that this was the cruelest government they'd ever dealt with. Now, putting party politics aside, I said, oh, well, I said, I suppose we could use the Evelyn Waugh defence and say we don't know how much more cruel it would be if there were not 7 or 8 Jesuit alumni at the table, but I don't think the Evelyn Waugh defence works. I think we've got to accept that very often the problem out there is the same as the problem in here. within the church, within the Marian family or whatever. How do we provide the stimulus for young people to want to take on that life of public service? The other point I'd make, and I'd make it strongly to the young people in the audience, is this, and it's not to decry minor parties or independents or whatever, but I think one of the problems confronting modern democracy is this. In our society at the moment, there's been a mammoth loss of trust in major institutions, whether it be the church, the banks, aged care facilities, or whatever, including a major loss of trust in major political parties. But guess what? In a democracy, it's the major political parties which generally have some philosophical rudder and the umbrella under which a broad church of people can come together and effect the compromises that are necessary in politics. And at the moment, I think a lot of voters, particularly young voters, say, well, we don't trust the major political parties to do that. But if we don't trust the major political parties to do it, what entities are there who can do it? And it's all very well to talk about having a lot of independence in your parliament, but a parliament with a lot of independence in it is going to have its own set of challenges over against a parliament where there's a clear majority from major political parties. So there are some very big questions at the moment as to how our democracy can actually deliver for those fundamental values, including human dignity.
Julia Gillard certainly found how difficult navigating groups of independents can be.
Indeed. Yeah.
Frank, how do we give authentic voice to the cry of our First Nations people? What are the next steps?
Well, the first step always has to be attentive to the Indigenous voices. If we do that respectfully, the step after that is then to ask, of their aspirations, which of those aspirations are justified? And that requires a respectful dialogue in terms of the morality of politics. Then I think arises the question, which of those morally justified aspirations is politically achievable? And that requires a dialogue. For example, if you're going to have a referendum, it means that you need all the major political parties at the table. And then comes the ultimate question. If I've made an assessment of what is it that Aboriginal people themselves want, of those wants which are justified, and of those justified wants, which ones are politically achievable, then which of those am I going to invest some time and energy and skin in the game? And that's a challenge there for all of us. So, for example, at the moment, yes, what we've had it since 2007, Peter. This is now the 6th election where we're talking about Indigenous recognition in the Constitution. In the past, we often spoke about having a preamble or an acknowledgement in the Constitution of Aboriginal history, of Aboriginal present reality, of Aboriginal aspirations, and then allowing the Commonwealth Parliament to legislate on those matters. Since the Uluru Statement, the key Indigenous groups have said, no, that's not what we want a voice. Well, the question then becomes, what is that voice and what would its role be? Now, these are very complex questions. I can say that with some knowledge because I was one of 3 non-Indigenous Australians appointed by the Morrison government to the 18-member working group looking at the design or the co-design of an Indigenous voice. And so that requires very respectful dialogue. If I could give just one example, many of you will remember that at one stage we had an ATSIC, an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Commission. Now that was finally abolished with support of both the Liberal Party and the Labor Party because it was seen not to be working anymore. Now, one of the key roles of ATSIC was to make decisions about resource allocation and service delivery. So when ATSIC was abolished, Aboriginal people themselves did a lot of work to design what they called a Congress of Australia's First Peoples. And they said, we've learnt the lessons from ATSIC. We don't want it dealing with service delivery or resource allocation. We want it more to be a voice. Well, guess what? It didn't develop any traction. Now, in part, that was because they thought they didn't get enough resources from government. But also, imagine yourself in a remote Aboriginal community, starved of resources, starved of services, and your Congress representative turns up and says, well, no, we've got nothing to do with service delivery. We've got nothing to do with resource allocation, but we're here to empower your voice. Well, a lot of busy Aboriginal leaders in local communities said, well, thank you, but no thanks. We've got actual practical work that needs to be done. So these are some of the issues that have to be dealt with respectfully if we're ever going to move simply beyond the platitudes about saying, oh yes, we're in favour of the Uluru Statement. Yes, let's get on board with the Uluru Statement, but that means getting to work on the hard yards that need to be done in order to convince both sides of politics to get on board with something which is practical in terms of governance for the future.
And you were saying before about the referendum or a referendum on Indigenous voice. And I suppose what would be worse than not having a referendum is having a referendum that failed.
Absolutely.
It would be a disaster.
Yep. And I mean, no disrespect to Mr. Albanese, but just remember, Bob Hawke was a pretty charismatic Prime Minister. And 1988 was a big year for the bicentenary. Bob Hawke put 4 referendum questions to the people, saying right up to the last minute, these are simple, unchallenging, very Australian propositions. The maximum vote any of those got was 37%. Maximum. So the lesson is, if you want to put anything to referendum, yep, sure. Don't bother considering anything unless it's endorsed by the Aboriginal leaders, if it's about Aboriginal representation. But then it's got to be something that wins the support of both the Labor Party and the Liberal Party.
Frank and everyone, we're at our last question, and this comes from Robert. He says, our base self-interest tends to be thoughtless of others, which has resulted in a widening gap between rich and poor. This is also true of nations. Is it corrupting our community? Can it be changed?
If it were unbridled, then of course it would be corrupting our community. But we, particularly as Christians, we always have to maintain hope that it can be changed. We always have to maintain the hope. Sure, we believe in the kingdom to come, but we also believe that the kingdom is breaking in here and now. And if we believe the kingdom is breaking in here and now, we know that things need not simply follow some sort of Marxist or automatic equation that it's power and money only that speaks. No, we are here espousing our own human dignity and that of our neighbour. And if we espouse the human dignity of everyone, both in process and in outcomes, then I think we can help to make for a better world. And that's the challenge. And that's why I think an evening like this is so welcome. Let's maintain that hope. Let's keep that light burning.
Wonderful, Frank. And I have just been passed one final question, and I think it is appropriate if you don't mind. A final word for the community gathered. You've spoken to the Marian Church. A final word to the Marists as they go their way this evening. What advice do you give us? How can we be, in the words of St. Marcelin, good Christians and good citizens for our communities?
Well, to be good Christians, I think at this stage, with the next phase of our plenary council coming up, to be involved with that with hope, and to make sure that particularly the voice of young people is heard. As people who are engaged in the community generally, that you will always be out there saying, right, this proposal that's being put forward, how does it advance the well-being of the planet? How does it advance the well-being of those who are on the margins? How does it advance the common good of the community? And how does it advance the prospect that we might have a deeper interior life? If we keep applying those criteria as Marist in the community at large, then I think we can bring the light to bear. And better to light a candle than to curse the darkness.
Thank you very much, Frank. Thank you. Frank's work has prompted various responses over the years. In 1994, the National Australia Day Council named him as an Australian Achiever. In 1998, during the Wiki debate, Prime Minister Paul Keating described him as a meddling priest. And a later Prime Minister, Kevin Rudd, described him as an ethical burr in the nation's saddle. And the National Trust has classified him as a living national treasure. So, Frank, you have shared your goodness, you have shared your gifts, not just with us tonight, but with the entire nation, and we're certainly thankful for that. So, sincere gratitude for tonight being with us to deliver the Marian Lecture. You speak with passion, but you always speak with balance and in a measured way. You know, you're a man of common sense who speaks sense, and we really appreciate that. But you hold those standards and those values up to us, and they are certainly what we need to move towards as a national community, but also as a Marist community. You've encouraged us to delve into the very heart of issues and assess them against the key principles of human rights and the gospel of Jesus. And so we hope and pray that that kingdom that we preach, that reign of God, will come in some way through what we do as Christians in our society. So you're a friend to so many in our country, Frank, particularly among the lost, the least and the last. And we're pleased that you could make time for us tonight. And we are delighted to call you a friend to us Marists. So thank you and every blessing for your ministry of advocacy and human rights. Thank you, Frank.
Thank you very much, Peter, and thanks to you all.
To our organisers tonight, to Marco Farrell, Nathan Ahern, Lindsay Franco, Tony Clark, and the Mission and Life Formation team, sincere thanks for bringing this lecture about. To Maddie Clark for introducing us and being with us, and she is a voice, a young voice at the Plenary Council coming up. We wish you all the best, Maddie, for that in particular. And just finally, before we finish with a Salve Regina, just an advertisement. The Association National Assembly, the third National Assembly is approaching. Remember the dates. The 2 online preparatory gatherings, firstly on the 7th of June, and then on the 27th of July, and then the Assembly from the 26th to the 28th of August in Sydney at Mary MacKillop Place, or online. Registrations are open, so don't delay. Many thanks to all of you who have been part of this Marian Lecture tonight. I don't know what the final figures are, but I do know that in some places, at Kilmore, for instance, 35 were gathered together as a community, and I know that's been the case in other places. So whether as individuals you've been part of this or in groups, thank you very much for participating. And I hope that we can take some of that passion that Frank has instilled with us as we go, because there is nothing more important than us witnessing in our own Marian way, in our own Marist way, to the dignity of every single human being we encounter and every single human being in this world. It is the inherent essence of the gospel. It is what Jesus was most concerned about, to lift up the lowly and to give hope to all those who struggle. So with that, I wish you every good wish. God bless. And let's just pause and pray the Salve Regina. Thank you and good night.
Salve Regina, Mater misericordiae, vita dulcedo, et spes nostra salve, obtenamus Virgo